Just about everyone signed in, so I think I'll be turning it over to our chair and president, Susan Cote-Freeman, once more to start the day. Susan, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to day 4. I hope you've been with us since the beginning of the week, and if you have, I hope you've enjoyed, found our discussions informative and useful. Encore une fois, bienvenue à tous nos participants et à nos panélistes distingués aujourd'hui. C'est un plaisir de vous avoir parmi nous. So we're continuing to explore our question, which is what's wrong with Canada? Are we taking anti-corruption seriously? And since Monday, we've been taking a look at our institutions, our toolbox, and as James mentioned earlier, today we're going to go a little closer to the ground, and we're going to look at how companies and organizations are addressing the problem of corruption. We're also going to hear from one of the clean countries on the TI Corruption Index and see how in Sweden, our fellow chapter has been dealing with some of the cases that have happened there. So we have a great panel. It's going to be a terrific discussion, so look forward to it. And this is the moment where the one thing I forgot to mention is I look forward to the further evolution of the car metaphor today, because it's been referred to every day. So I hope we'll have some of that again today. Now, this is the time where I thank our donors. So I want to thank our platinum supporter, Export Development Canada, our gold supporters, BLG, Blake's, Banque Nationale, Deloitte Canada, Dentons Canada, Skypower Global, and Siemens, and our silver supporters, ACFO, Alessa, Kinross Gold, KPMG Canada, Thales Canada, and Vidocq Group. I also, at this moment, make a call out to all of you to become TI Canada members or supporters. We need your support, and you can do so by visiting our website at transparencycanada.ca. And we hope you will respond to our call. A quick reminder that we're in webinar mode, so if you want to make comments, you can use the comment bar for that. Keep it civil. If you have a question, use the Q&A box, and our moderator will be moderating the questions that are coming in and dealing with them as they flow in. And our moderator for today's session is Richard Bistrong. I think everybody knows Richard because he is a personality in the world of compliance, but we're delighted to have him with us today as a moderator for the next session. For those of you who don't know Richard, he is the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery. He spent much of his career as an international sales executive, and he currently consults and speaks on foreign bribery, ethics, and compliance issues from the frontline perspective. Richard was the vice president of international sales for a large publicly traded manufacturer of police and military equipment, which included residing and working in the UK. In 2007, as part of a cooperation agreement with the United States Department of Justice and subsequent immunity from prosecution in the UK, Richard assisted the United States, the UK, and other governments in their understanding of how FCPA bribery and other export violations occurred and operated in international sales. In 2012, Richard was sentenced as part of his own plea agreement for violating the FCPA, and he served 14.5 months at a federal prison camp, returning home in December 2013. So as we talk about anti-bribery enforcement and compliance in Canada, this is an issue that Richard understands and appreciates from a very personal and professional perspective. So Richard, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Susan, thank you so much for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to moderate today's session for the Week of Dialogue, titled, What's Wrong with Canada? Are we taking anti-corruption seriously enough? And today's session is going to talk about examples from overseas, how to address the problem. Susan, it's such a pleasure to moderate this discussion today with panelists Ulrich Åshuvud, Chairman of Transparency International Sweden, Mairead Lavery, President and CEO Export Development Canada, and Kerry Adler, who I think he is having some technical issues joining us, but he'll be with us shortly. Kerry is the president and CEO and director of the Skypower global group of companies. And a special and a personal thanks to James and Susan and their team for being so brave as to ask a New Yorker to moderate a panel on what's wrong with Canada. And having worked with the TI teams in Panama, the Netherlands, and Norway, I really have a personal appreciation for the work that TI provides in moving us on our journey to transparency, good governance, and ethical business practices. So by way of background, before we start diving into the lessons from overseas, in referencing a recently released report by Transparency International entitled Exporting Corruption 2020, Assessing Enforcement of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, where Canada compared unfavorably to peer economies that were also major exporters that were covered in the report, James Cone was quoted in the National Post as saying, "There's unfortunately a persistent belief that corruption is not something Canadian companies need to think about, either because some companies just don't understand the risk, or worse, some companies think they won't get caught." But I think Drago Kos from the OECD was a little more optimistic on Monday's session when he shared, and I don't think I'll ever forget this line. He said, "Canada should be a leader in anti-corruption and has all the elements of being a great car, but now you have to drive it." So I guess it goes back to, it's one thing to have the structures and institutional frameworks in place, as Canada does, but you also need to have the political and corporate will to use them. So maybe today we're going to talk about the corporate will. So with that multi-perspective panel, maybe we can address some best practices from those who have had overseas experiences, which can help Canada in this anti-corruption journey. So I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist with a question to launch their own experience as we all think about Canada's way forward. So let's start with Mairead Lavery. Mairead joined Export Development Canada in 2014 as the Senior Vice President for Business Development and was appointed President and CEO in 2019. Since joining EDC, Mairead's focus has been on expanding the EDC's impact on behalf of Canadian exporters by understanding their needs and championing their objectives in Canada and in markets around the world. Mairead is also the first woman to occupy EDC's executive role, and that's in its 75-year history. And in 2015, shortly after joining EDC, Mairead experienced another very personal and proud landmark when she became a Canadian citizen. Prior to EDC, Mairead held numerous executive roles at Bombardier during her 16 years there, where she managed large and complex portfolios. Welcome, Mairead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard.
So Mairead, as the CEO of a development bank, you're really at the crossroads of promoting Canadian exports, while at the same time you have a responsibility to ensure that your projects promote business integrity, good governance, and oversight. So given your own experience with due diligence, money laundering, and compliance, how do you help your partners with anti-corruption measures and best practices while also promoting export activities in what can be some really high risk and volatile regions?
Thanks for that, Richard, and thank you, James and Susan, for the invitation to speak today. You're absolutely right. Export Development Canada, as Canada's export credit agency, is at the intersection of many points on this subject. We're certainly at the intersection, as you would refer to it in your introduction, Richard, of public institution, versus the corporate world. As a crown corporation, our shareholder is the government of Canada, but our customers are the Canadian companies that we serve. So we're really at the heart of what corporate Canada is dealing with on this issue. I'd say we have a lot of our own personal experience with being at that intersection point. What has it meant for EDC, and what certainly has it meant for our customers? So as Canada's ECA, last year we supported 17,000 companies across Canada, from the very smallest of companies to the very largest of companies. And I think that gives us quite an interesting perspective, and perhaps one for reflection for the people viewing today, is what does it mean to different sizes of companies, and what does the challenge present? Because sometimes we talk about this in a very homogeneous fashion, corruption, anti-bribery, how do we deal with this? But actually how we deal with this might be different depending on the type of company that we're actually working with. So I'll perhaps put that out there as well. Also recognizing the companies that we serve, they do work in 200 markets around the world. That's a significant breadth for us to be dealing with this issue. And of course, dealing with different countries' reactions and their own positioning on the issue of corruption is one of the challenges that not only we face, but of course that our customers face as well. So as the president of EDC, I think I'll start at the very top and really talk about a few different themes, and maybe I'll keep going with the car analogy. It seems it's resonating over the last few days. You know, I've been really clear since I became president around what the pillars of my presidency would be. And certainly championing trade, but responsible trade are two of those pillars, followed up with inclusion, diversity, and equity. So I think that's probably a surprise to most people to hear in this corporate world that you're really adhering to social values linked with trade. And it's extremely important because it is, we firmly believe that doing good is good for business, and there's ways in which Canada can lead in this respect. So really important that we bring these values to life. And when I talk about our own experience, it starts with the driver of the car. The driver of the car points the car in the direction that you're going. And for me, that speaks to what is it that EDC is saying are our values, what are the principles we adhere to, because that sets the tone for the conversation. And that tone from the top is extremely important, and certainly something that I see as our role in the Canadian ecosystem and indeed internationally. How do we set the tone from the top? What do we expect and what do we not accept when it comes to corruption and bribery, money laundering, and many of the different aspects of financial crimes that we're talking about here? Now, as much as we have those values and are 100% committed to those values, I think, Richard, we have to recognize that it is a journey. And it's a journey that I think many companies are at different stages of this journey. They're either not on the map at all and haven't really started the journey, or like EDC, they're on the journey and have had some, I guess, guideposts along the way that have told them they're off track, what they're doing is working, or what they're not doing, or what they have done hasn't worked very well in the past. And I think for us, that maybe sets also our tone. We recognize that this will be continuous improvement, that we're going to learn. And certainly my objective is that the learnings of EDC can become the guideposts for our customers and our clients who perhaps don't have the access to the same resources that EDC does have. So let me share an example to make that real for you. Where was it that we went off the road? And therefore could see that the car was not going in the right direction. And certainly the one I would observe is one which is a very public file involving EDC, which is the Weston transaction, or the sale of an aircraft to the Gupta family of South Africa. And that was a transaction that we did in April 2015, a $41 million loan, by no stretch of the imagination, the biggest loan that EDC has done. But the sale of an aircraft to the Gupta family, which EDC financed, Subsequent to that, in 2017, the company actually defaulted on the loan, and then the plane actually disappeared from the public ability to see where the plane was at. And there was lots of concerns that that plane was used to actually help members of the Gupta family escape legal repercussions in South Africa. You know, when we reflect on that transaction, I think it was just such a moment in EDC history whereby it was only when we had experienced that we really truly understood how far off the road that we were and what we needed to do to get back onto the road. And we truly understood the cost of getting it wrong. At the time, our due diligence procedures absolutely looked at who was involved in the transaction and looked at the obligor. And we did highlight concerns vis-a-vis the persons involved behind the entities, but we didn't actually assume a more detailed review of those risks. And perhaps that certainly led to us to change things like our own review process vis-a-vis politically exposed persons. And I'm guessing the very sophisticated audience that may be on this call is going, well, why weren't you there before? And I would say it's because sometimes the only way that you learn is by failing. And that's what Canadian companies face. It actually doesn't become real to companies until you've experienced it yourself. And that's an extremely costly way to learn. And I hope that we can actually use our learnings to make sure Canadian companies don't do that. And it told us, you know, if I go back to the car analogy, what did we need to do? Well, we actually needed to figure, were we driving the car properly in the first place? We needed to go back to our processes. We needed to have stronger controls and assessments and investigations around politically exposed processes. We needed to educate our team. We needed to give them the driving course. We needed to tell them this is what it looks like. And we needed to tell them that when you're driving on the verge of the road, that's too far off. We want to be in center lane. So really trying to build up our processes, but unfortunately from a position of having been very challenged with those processes. You know, and we've had other examples in our history that are perhaps not as big or not as public. And sometimes, you know, that little moment when you think you're going off-road and you course correct is important as well. But of course, the big moment is the one that you often reflect on. And then I come back to, you know, what does that mean for Canadian companies? And I know, Richard, that was where you were trying to get me to. It's the sense of, given that, and given that I am a crown corporation, that we can actually invest the resources to help Canadian companies understand what they need to do. So if you want to think of us in this context, think of us as an insurance policy. If EDC is asking the questions in a checklist and challenging you, who you're doing business with, there's a reason for it. And it's not to be seen as an administrative burden, although often it is. It's actually, they're helping you understand the risk of you doing business, and having experienced the cost to our reputation of Export Development Canada and of Canada, then we can actually say to them, this is a really strong insurance policy that you should take. You should be building up your processes. We can help you do that. We can also insist that you do it with your obligors, with what we put into the contractual provisions. So there's that sense of a carrot and a stick, as well as helping Canadian companies, because I'll perhaps end my comment by saying the one thing that we cannot do is decide not to engage. Canadian companies are trading in 200 markets around the world. We cannot look at them and say, you should not do this. This is too risky. Our job is to be there and help them as they do that trade, to provide the tools for them, and to truly show them the guardrails they should be applying in their business. So for me, the final message is it's all about engagement and actually reducing the risk. Otherwise, if we go with an ignorance model, we will never make any difference, both in companies or in countries.
Well, thank you, Mairead. And, you know, appreciating that, going through a crucible and understanding how things can get off the rails and how difficult it can sometimes be to course correct. it's wonderful that EDC is using that experience to sort of raise the water level for the Canadian export community. So that is a wonderful way to help the greater commercial community. And we'll have some more questions around that too. And I see that Kerry Adler has joined us. So welcome to the virtual table, Kerry.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I got my Zoom uniform on and didn't get the technical aspects correct. We had some challenges, but I'm pleased to be here.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think once we get started with our dialogue, I might have to shut my video off for a second because I seem to have lost the Q&A box, and I want to make sure that we get to everybody's questions. So we're going to welcome you, and I might disappear for a few minutes, and then I'll be right back. So Kerry is the founder, president, and chief executive officer of the Skypower group of companies. Since its founding in 2003, Skypower has now become one of the largest and most innovative leaders in the development of large-scale solar energy generation projects with a presence in over 36 countries around the world. Kerry has also taken a very active role in advancing the climate change agenda and has won numerous awards, including the United Nations Global Entrepreneur of the Year, and is a UN SDG champion, among other global accolades, international advisory roles, and directorships. So Kerry, welcome.
Thank you.
So Kerry, you lead an organization that has a global footprint in some parts of the world where the TI Corruption Perceptions Index rates as high in corruption risk. So how have you kept your company, its employees, out of what's often the competing corporate objectives between the pressure to succeed and the pressure to comply? So Kerry, asked another way, how do you deliver the message that to your global teams that integrity never has to be sacrificed to succeed? And Kerry, I think your experience here isn't only an example for Canada, but I think we can all learn from your perspective.
Thank you, and thanks for your very kind words. You know, the way we look at the world is that there are various cultures that have existed long before we have. And those cultures have continued for decades, and in fact, in some countries for centuries, ways of doing business. But we've grown. We've learned that those ways of doing business serve some, but not many or all. And a contract of any form, whether it's for a solar park or a bridge, it's not a contract if it wasn't fairly earned at a market price, at terms and conditions that are congruent to the objectives of that government. So in our journey over the last 17 years since our founding, what we have explored and learned is that there are cultures where certain governments are used to operating under the context of facilitation payments or reward payments. And we took a step back because when you're building a reputation, a company, when you're building a track record, when you want to build a business, the contracts that you secure are sacrosanct. And those contracts serve as a litmus test to the quality of you as a leader of your company, of your employees. And if we participate in any fashion, then we're just perpetuating the continued challenges that corruption has presented. You know, one of the stories that I used after the former president of Tanzania visited me here in Toronto, I call it the lottery of birth. So countries all over the world, even Canada, we've seen it, we've read the stories and all seen the commission. But this child is a lottery of birth. He didn't choose his parents. He was born in a country where perhaps leaderships before him, decades before, or even 1 decade before, did business in a way that was not only corrupt, ethically wrong, but served the interests of few, but not the interests of all. And now the time has come where energy, which is our business, solar energy, which is our business, our only business. Now time has come that solar is something that that country can affordably bring online to bring the much needed power to its people, to ensure they're educated, to ensure they have an opportunity to participate in society, and to ensure that they could contribute like all of us. But because of the sins of the forefathers and administrations of the past, the creditworthiness of that country is suspect at best, doesn't come close to investment grade credit. And on the indexes, it's off the charts in terms of corruption and challenges of doing business. Because the old way of doing business was the old boys club or men's club or women's club, whatever you prefer. It was a club, and if you were in the club, that's how you participated, and that's how you were rewarded. But this poor child finally has hope. He sees and he hears, he reads in the paper. Because chances are he doesn't have a cellular phone, and if he does, it's very expensive for him to power it. So he reads that electricity is finally coming, solar power. He's excited. And as those trucks roll in and build those transmission lines and those distribution lines, they go right by his house. And that poor child, which is an average child of a family of 3 in a country like Tanzania or other countries around the world, he'll never get power because the cost of that power is so high, not because the generation cost, but the cost of building that infrastructure, lending, and taking the financial risk of building in that country. If you look at it in Canada or in the United States, in some states you pay 17, 16 cents a kilowatt hour just as a proxy. The sun in the continent of Africa, power should be 4, 5, 6, 7 cents. But in a meaningful quantity, it cannot be delivered outside of the DFI funding, the World Bank or the IFC gives some form of grants. We cannot make a meaningful impact on the lives of those children who are our future, simply because we have all sat back and allowed corruption to occur. So you asked the key question, and that is, how have we addressed it? The first and foremost is education. All of our staff go through rigorous review training and continual update in terms of what is wrong and what is right. There are laws in some countries that allow for payments to be made. Under the former Secretary of State of the US, Rex Tillerson, understand that they allowed for payments to be made for any sub-earth oil extraction or gas to allow American companies to become competitive to other countries that allowed that. But just because one does it doesn't mean that the other should. That the playing field should be level, but you can't allow corruption or payments of any kind to be made in order to level that playing field. It should just be prohibited. So we start with education, and then we have controls. The best way to control corruption is to control the bank. It's to control the way that payments, monies leave a company. Because if monies are controlled at the highest of levels with accountability to the highest level. So within Skypower, we go through a procedure for monies to leave the country. I cannot initiate a wire myself without someone from our finance and the treasury department authorizing that. They cannot release it without my final say so, and they cannot be influenced to release something because they are accountable. And the way that we build those processes enable us to control the funds. If you control the funds, you can control the potential for corruption. So a CEO of a company, any company, is ultimately accountable for any form of corruption of any kind. And if they're not, they should be. It's not okay for them to say, well, it happened, I didn't know about it, because it's the responsibility of the CEO to put in place the necessary processes that if any form of corruption occurs, they're accountable. Mm-hmm. Why is it that, I mean, we as a company, we go through 14, 15 audits a year for our various holding entities. And we have hundreds of companies underneath that serve a special purpose vehicle. But any country that we are deploying capital, that goes through an audit. Why is it not, and maybe this is the solution that would solve a lot of issues. Signing up a form that we do when we engage in any country, I mean, I take it seriously because I have to sign it. But that's not enough, because facilitation payments, even today under Canadian laws, are legal. But how is someone supposed to determine what is fair and reasonable in the context? If someone accelerates a permit and you buy them dinner, is that fair or reasonable? We don't believe that there should be any facilitation, especially if companies in Canada or in the United States are going to foreign countries, bringing foreign direct investments, creating jobs, stimulating the environment, improving their GDP. They shouldn't have to pay a price of any kind in order for them to be considered an acceptable supplier. So education, process and controls is at Skypower the way we have navigated in 17 years away from any form of corruption, and reporting. I can think in recent memory, the only issue, one of our employees was in a country in Northern Africa, was on his way to the 50th birthday of the governor of a state in Nigeria. And as he was driving to the governor's 50th birthday party, he stopped on the side of the road and out of his pocket bought a painting. It cost him about $60 US, 75 Canadian at the time. Before he went into the party, just to give you an idea of some of the training, he picked up the phone, personally called me on the cell phone and said, look, it's 50th birthday party. I've been invited. This is an important country for us. I just want you to know that I'm giving him a painting. That stimulated, the answer was yes, it's appropriate, it's fair, it's reasonable. It wasn't to win a contract. We had already signed an agreement. That stimulated internally a report, the red flag report, that was reported, and it went to our board, and as a matter of practice to our auditors, this is an action that we took and was not, I mean, we positively report when we do something like that, where we give a gift of some form. In Uzbekistan, we showed up with maple syrup, bottles of maple syrup. That was notated to our auditors as well. You know, they have other types of gifts, and it's culturally, you have to accept that there are differences, and it's kind of countries, sometimes they come to our offices, not recent, but we host a lot of people, a lot of heads of state, ministers, constantly. Now we're doing it virtually. And it's often thought as appropriate to come with some gift, cultural and value, and cultural in terms of a thought. But it has, that is normal, that's acceptable. But pay to play, we've lost billions of dollars in business because we simply do not have the interest or the time to win business that we did not fairly deserve.
Well, thank you, Kerry. And I think, you know, the measure of a company's ethics and compliance program is the commercial resistance, or, you know, the commercial backbone, so to speak, to say no and to say we're not going to engage there because, and Drago talked about this on Monday, because the value proposition there is who's paying the most, not who has the best products and services. And
I just want to, if I may, I just want to interject. So you stimulated an interesting memory that I want to share with you. So with the group and the people listening. So I'm in a country in Africa, and we've gotten into the practice of anyone we do business with, and before we actually go, we send very clear guidelines. All of our agreements have, we go through extensive KYC, background checks, but anytime we engage with the government, we start by explaining that we don't tolerate or participate. We are reporters as opposed to participants in any form of corruption. And we make that very clear. In this particular country, the meeting happened very hastily, and I walk into a meeting room and you got a minister of finance, a minister of energy, and some people from a power company all sitting around the table, and the lights were off. They couldn't get the power on, and I mean, this is how power-starved this country is. So I started my meeting by introducing myself and stating our values very clearly. And I said, look, I want to just make it very clear that, you know, many countries like my own have a history or a belief that foreigners, or even our own selves, believe that in different forms of doing business, we are married to anti-corruption. Everything we do, we report transparent. I mean, our majority shareholder and our limited partner, CalPERS, is, that's what they expect. That's how we expect it. And we lay out very clearly the rules of the game. The Minister of Finance of this country got up. If he had a rope, it was like he would strangle me. He got very flustered. He says, "Are you accusing me of being corrupt?" I mean, it was an anger, and absolutely not. I was not accusing him. I was trying to just explain, and I think that's one of the challenges is, people don't set those expectations, and then they find themselves in a situation that they don't know how to handle. So part of the education has to involve outward upfront communication, because if you're communicating upfront what your expectations are and making sure the other party understands those, you eliminate a lot of the uncomfortableness when someone thinks or suggests. Because the worst form of corruption, and we've seen it, where you built a project and you're waiting for something to happen and it doesn't. And you've got $100 million in a country and there's one piece for you to get paid. And they just delay and delay and delay. The worst form of corruption is when they don't ask. They just turn up the pain meter and wait for you to come to them, because this way they can't be found complicit. Yep. And when you don't come to them, they continue to turn up the pain meter. And I will tell you that we have projects today in India that have suffered from doing business the way we believe is right. And that is what the contract says. No payments on the side, no special treatment for individuals. We suffered and continue to this day in many regions. And we engage with the Canadian government, who's been absolutely fantastic in advancing those interests. We share with them our concerns. So that communication is key up front, whether they want to hear it or not. But it leads to a longer term, cleaner, better relationship and the sanctity of a contract, which is paramount in doing business anywhere in the world.
Very well said. Thank you, Kerry. That is a great power of example. And as I shared in introducing you, not just to Canadian companies, but throughout the world. Well, next, it's a pleasure to introduce Ulrich Åshuvud, the Chair of Transparency International Sweden. So Ulrich is an international lawyer with a long experience from different management perspectives, including his work in the Swedish Ministry of Justice and the Swedish Migration Agency, as well as Chief of Staff for EU and International Affairs at the Swedish Migration Agency. He has led multilateral cooperative frameworks and has been a lead consultant as well as the head of delegation for several international assignments, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, Ukraine, Vietnam, and Mozambique, both in the field of justice and migration. Ulrich is also the founder and CEO of Just Develop, a management and consulting firm established in 2016, specializing in justice and migration management. So Ulrich, welcome.
Thank you.
So Ulrich, maybe we can look at Sweden as a cautionary learning experience for Canada. After all, it's a top 10 CPI performer, yet a number of large Swedish multinationals have run afoul of international anti-bribery laws, some of them now included in our largest global enforcement settlements. So Ulrich, do you think, as James Cohn shared in that National Post piece, that like Canada, Sweden also had a persistent belief that corruption is not something that Swedish companies needed to think about? And did it take multiple global scandals to change that belief, if you agree with that proposition? And the second part of the question, Ulrich, is what state institutions in Sweden were strengthened from these experiences that you think can help Canada in its anti-corruption journey?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for having me on the panel from TI Canada. It's also very interesting to be part of this discussion. We've already in Sweden, in Transparency International Sweden, looked at this, and we find it to be an amazing setup. So, well, congratulations to that so far. What I wanted to say on the first question, and I'll be a bit boring, maybe in saying yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think with, and I'll go back to the lists maybe to start off. Yes, we're top 10 at CPI, and we've been that for quite some time. What does that mean? Well, it's still what you expect possibly Sweden to be over a longer period of time, but it's the perception of corruption within the public sector. We have to remember that as well. No? We're not measuring the private sector in that CPI. But there is another list that you mentioned that you do not want to be on, and we're on another top 10 list in the sense that we have two major companies on the top 10 on the FCPA list. So we have both Ericsson recently, now with $1 billion, and Telia company since before. And I think with the thing, yes, was when Telia ended up on the list, it was a shocker. It was a great shock in Swedish society, also a state-owned company, not fully, but still. And there were a lot of questions being asked there. How could this happen? And how can we be both ignorant in this case and naive? Because naive is a word that comes back in Swedish language quite a lot, and I'll get back to that a bit later. But I feel so people woke up, and we could see in our work within Transparency International that in Sweden, we could see in our corporate supporters forum that more and more companies wanted to join. And the interest was much bigger than before. That trend has even become stronger. And not just because Ericsson then came last year with this, with quite a big scandal, to be honest. And we were disappointed in both in Sweden, but also as Transparency International, disappointed in the fact that, well, you can always make a mistake and you can rectify. All companies will have challenges like Skypower. You will end up having to make a choice. And if you have a good compliance, that choice is easily made, and you have a good reporting system, and people can say, okay, thank you for the information, we're happy, okay, there's no deal. Now, what happened in Ericsson, we don't know fully yet. We will know and learn throughout the 3 years that the monitorship is on, and after that, when the monitorship is off, I think we'll get to know a bit more what actually happened. Ericsson would probably be one of the so-called cleanest companies and well-functioning in the compliance sector in the future. That's for sure. But what happened was that it was a systemic approach. There was a systemic problem within the company. It was not just once off. It was for 17 years in 5 countries. Now, how do you not discover that? That is an issue that we're still asking. We're still asking those questions. We have a great dialogue with them to understand. And they are definitely interested in talking with us and with others about this, and they're also learning a lot. Now, I would like to go back to the analogy or the discussion also on the vehicle before. Was when I look at this, I normally say, well, you need to have the leadership there, you need to have the tone from the top. Looking at what kind of vehicle you would need, you probably need an SUV when you're working with this. So it's a bumpy road, and on that SUV, you need probably a good crew. You need a compliance officer, or the chief compliance officer, probably to drive the car, hopefully with a good map reader on the side and the GPS on, but then hopefully then at the same time a toolbox, a big toolbox in the back seat. You don't want any backseat drivers there from the board who are telling you what to do and what to do. You want them to call in and ask you, what road are you on? Are you driving on the right road or on the wrong road? Are you driving the right direction or the wrong direction? Now, because that's the responsibility of the board and the leadership of the company. Now, I'm not sure Ericsson had people out in SUVs driving and trying to find out. Now, but coming back to Sweden, as a country, we say a lot that we have a trouble at the top as well. So it's not just that we have these two companies, but we have another trouble being a top CPI performer, another trouble, and that is money laundering. That we have had a number of cases now over the last years, not just last years, but also the last year, where our banks are failing on fighting and preventing money laundering. And that's also an eye-opener within Sweden, which has been, I'd say, it's quite painful for many. Apparently not very painful for the banks, because they're still making good money. Not enough painful, because the fines that, or the fees that they've had to pay are very, very high in the Swedish context. So both Swedbank and SEB, which are one of the two major banks, but they are the Nordic banks that have also had similar problems. Now, all bank CEOs have said, I've attended several conferences and panels on that, and at one panel about a year ago, they said, we have not done enough. We have not taken this seriously enough. All of them agreed, which was good in a sense. It was a closed room. Now it's an open room, and I'm transparent. I'm not quoting any in particular, but it was a bit interesting to say that they all agreed that they have not done enough. The question is, were they going to do enough in the future? Are they doing enough at this stage? So I'll go back to that second question to you that you asked about the institutions. Now, I think we have an issue here in Sweden because the institutions are not tackling corruption, the big corruption, outside Sweden. So that the exporting of corruption is a challenge for the Swedish law enforcement system, because they're not on that. And you could see that in the report that Sweden is also there. I think Sweden is slightly better than Canada. We are on the moderate enforcement, but still it's not enough. And obviously you'd like to see multiple cases coming out of both Telia, and we had Telia in court, and they're still in court actually. That has not settled, but they were actually acquitted in the first instance because the old legislation did not apply to certain parts of that Kazakhstan situation. Now, but looking at other, so I think we need more cases in our courts, and they will also understand how to prosecute them better. It is resource-wise, obviously very expensive for any prosecution on that. But secondly, let's say in terms of money laundering, our financial inspection in Sweden has not had enough resources. I'm not sure they have enough resources yet. And I think over time, we see that they need to step up their work. They are stepping it up, but I'd say they have to do a lot more. Because I think the banks probably will relax a bit again and not be on their toes. And why is that happening? And why is corruption happening in Ericsson? Again, coming back to the culture of the company, but also how engaging is the leadership in this? If you sit in the board, and I'll take an example of another Swedish multinational company in the energy sector, by the way. And I was talking to a representative from the board here and said, every time we have the board meeting, we have a list of things that go wrong. Basically, that we know are going wrong and what's going on with them and how they're working with them. They might be solutions or they might just be reports. That's right. Now, if you have a board who's not getting that type of list, and they never ask questions about what is going wrong in our company, because there's certainly something going wrong in our company somewhere, we would like to know. You need to have people who are interested in those questions, they are not afraid of hearing it, and they continue and persist on asking those questions. And they do not send out the chief compliance officer out of the boardroom when they've come with some hard news and some difficult news. They keep them there and say, we would like to know more about this. Now, I think that is what's happening in some of the companies, that they do not come up. They might be entering into the boardroom, but they're quite quickly out of the boardroom again, even if they should be there very often and on a frequent basis.
Well, thank you, Ulrich. I mean, it really does sound in Sweden that these major cases had certainly a big impact on the compliance community in Sweden, because there is such a robust compliance community there. even if, as you have shared, that the prosecutorial.
Now we lost Richard.
Oh, it appears we lost our moderator. So I might jump in for just 1 second to take over while Richard reboots.
Maybe I could say something more on that, just to another thing that we are working on, which I think is important in comparison with the Canadian situation as well. We've, for some years, we've been working on together, well, we've had a dialogue with the government about Sweden need to have a holistic approach tackling corruption, even if you're on the high list of CPI. And so we asked, we've advocated for a national action plan against corruption, or a national strategy, you can call it whatever you want. And it took quite some time, but last year they actually agreed that they would start that job and that work. And they're presently in doing that. So we expect to have a national action plan being presented at the, well, hopefully by the beginning of December this year. And that is that's important also to show the societal engagement against corruption, not just the political, but also showing that this is something that we need to do jointly in Sweden, not just one company or one agency, to lift it up on the agenda that even if we have a low corruption in the public sector, corruption still exists and we need to tackle it. So I think that's an important tool, and that will send out a message to a number of institutions in Sweden.
Great, thank you, Ulrich. I think there's a question here. I'll go to some of the questions while Richard is logging back in. And I think this one is for Mairead. I think we've heard some very interesting lessons from both Kerry and Ulrich about companies, and something we heard, I think, yesterday in our conversation about tools is there a standard for compliance that's available for companies? And one of our panelists replied, well, there's lots of examples out there. A lot of companies have a compliance program in place. It's about harmonizing those and expanding those. And I know TI Canada, we are in conversation with EDC about how to get good compliance, especially to small, medium-sized enterprises. So I'm wondering, from what you've heard from Kerry, from what you've heard from Ulrich, and your own research in-house, are there certain lessons that you're drawing that are new that you would add to the toolbox, or what's some of the additional advice? You went through some of the advice, but and here's the question, would EDC consider requiring its clients to have meaningful compliance programs? Any of you heard some key things that you would consider implementing today?
Yeah, absolutely. We insist on compliance programs. And I think, James, you framed it really well. And at the outset, I talked about the different levels, maybe, of sophistication of the companies. There's a big difference between someone who ends up in e-commerce trading inadvertently and exporting versus a large company where exporting and even investment abroad is part of their plan, and just the level of sophistication as to whether they have the resources to put into things like Ulrich talked about, our chief compliance officer. Like, small companies don't have that at the top of their mind. Large companies do. So when we look at the spectrum of companies that we support, we are absolutely reflecting on ourselves first. So we had to put in a chief compliance officer. We had to amend our processes. And by the way, those are processes that continually need to get updated, because it's not as if the not only the regulation, but the activities around terrorist financing, sanctions, corruption, bribery, money laundering, like, they're evolving all the time. So it's not just this static thing that you put in place. It's actually an evolving process. So I think it goes back to what we've been talking about, ensuring that the leadership, and Ulrich, I think your points on the board are very valuable, and ensuring that there's oversight, that there's questions are being asked, that there's best practice coming to the table, and that management is willing then to actually enact that and then drive that culture right throughout the organization. So when I think of the toolbox, It's to actually give to small companies, micro companies, that toolbox. It's a pre-packed toolbox. Here's the checklists. Here's the things you should be looking for. And by the way, if you trigger any of these, you are going to need to do more work, because there's no way that you can cover the whole gambit. So in fact, we are working with, I think we put some Transparency International checklists available to our clients. Large clients aren't going to be interested in that, but large clients are interested in what are we putting in contracts, what are we actually insisting they have before we enter into a financing. Small companies are saying, okay, that's helpful to me. Now I know what we need to ask, and now I know that I actually might need to go deeper. So I think it truly does depend. Of course, there are flags. We try to help them understand where are areas that you might be most at risk. Agents, partnerships, international money transfers. Kerry, I think you were talking about that. Like actually make it real to them in their business. And there is no better way to do that than giving them like case studies and examples and saying, in your industry, this is what typically happens, or in companies your size, this is what happens, or in markets like this. So things like the, of course, the country corrupt index is extremely important, country briefings. So we're always updating our view of specific countries. So the unfortunate thing, and it's the same in a car, there isn't one tool that sorts all of these problems out. You have to have many tools in your toolkit. But at the very least, there's a basic maintenance list that says, okay, am I good to go? Have I got 4 tires on this car? Can I actually drive it, whatever it looks like? So I think for me, it's starting there. How can we encourage small and medium-sized companies? Because those could be the large companies of the future, and we need to get in really early. I think that's the other thing, James. And I listened to the dialogue this week, and there was a huge amount of discussion around remediation agreements in Canada, deferred prosecution agreements, a lot of the enforcement type actions. But for companies, we need to get in there in the prevention side. We need to get this as part of their dialogue. We need this to be part of the public discourse. And we don't want them to get to the point where they suffer a huge risk to their business because they've got it wrong or they didn't have this in the process. So I think for me, it's telling them they need a toolkit. You need to have this at top of mind. Yes, you're worried about getting paid. Yes, you're worried about actually earning the contract in the first place. But here's the downside of actually driving too hard on those very business matters. If you don't get this right, you will have no business going forward. So I think just getting companies to understand that, and then putting the tools in that match the company where they're at, their stage of understanding, and just the size of the company. I think one of the things we're thinking about is as much as we can share a lot of knowledge and try to pass that on to many organizations, do companies need more? Do they need someone holding their hand? And, it's the same, and I see this particularly in the small and medium-sized space. There are many entities out there that are helping small and medium-sized companies with different parts of their business. All entrepreneurs are still looking for that one-stop shop. They're still looking to drive their innovative idea, their innovative business, and they're like, this is too much for me to deal with. So we're thinking of it even with more that development mindset. And I heard some references to more of the development finance community. They put technical assistance into companies. They do that to get an outcome. So we have to reflect, is saying you need a toolbox and your toolbox should have this in it enough, versus actually going in and coaching companies with the toolbox. So something that we're maybe thinking of that is much more active to try and help companies.
Great, thank you, Mairead, and welcome back, Richard. I see you had a power surge. Richard, do you mind if I monopolize my position for a follow-up question, and then I'll hand it right back over to you as moderator? This is, I don't know if this is abuse of power position or not, but I'll take the example to go to another question from the Q&A based on what you said about case studies, Mairead. And I think, in my experience, that's always the thing. A lot of companies think there is maybe a silver bullet, which there's not. There's only cases and adaptation, having the right systems in place. So for one case study, I think that would be interesting. Going back to Kerry, we have a question. Hi, Kerry. In instances where payments are held up by unspoken expectations, do you have suggestions on steps that can be taken to collect payment? And I will turn myself back off with that and put the moderator function back to Richard.
You know, it actually is the most important question, because the answer is accountability. And it's not just payments. It's, you know, we have in Central Asia, we have a $5 billion contract, which is ready to go, all the pieces in place, but one piece of paper is being held up. And you can guess, right? You can speculate. You don't know for certain. Are they expecting something? And this is live as we're happening now. It held up for 2 years. We are going to hold them accountable. We've had issues in countries like India where we haven't been paid for 12 or 13 months. We send people to sit outside their door for 9 months every single day from 9 in the morning till 5 outside the electric company's offices in their waiting area, hoping that maybe they'll recognize that a contract is an obligation. The challenges that I see people struggle with is twofold. One, they don't know, there's not like a 1-800 number you can call when you suspect that there is corruption anywhere in the world. There's no clear path. I mean, I have a challenge in Central Asian country. Who do I call? You go up to the ombudsman, he pushes you off. You send a letter to the president's office, it gets intercepted or cast down to someone else. So what you invariably find yourself is frustrated. So if you're not prepared, if you're not prepared to hold them accountable and upholds that the contract is paramount, then you shouldn't go in the country in the first place. And if you feel that you're not being treated properly, and that's where this, you know, where the genesis of great ideas is, fear is the greatest inhibitor. If someone knows that they could be called on, and not just to their president or to their minister or whatever level, or it could come to light, they could get a slap on the back and say, don't do that again. There has to be some fear created to show people that they can't just do it and get away with it. And it should be, you know, maybe it's a global level, maybe it's at the UN level. And that to governments, I mean, look, these developing countries depend on the World Bank and EBRD and all these BFIs and EDC, and, you know, there should be, and again, not an accusation, but actual factual, right? Because anybody can accuse anybody. But the key is, if you really want to ensure you get paid and ensure your contracts are honored, ensure, you know, decrees of presidents or orders in cabinet are honored, you have to, when you go to that country in the first instance, you have to be prepared to take whatever measures to hold them accountable to what they committed to, whether it's a payment or whether it's honoring a term of the contract. And that's the way we look at it. That's our responsibility. And if we're not prepared to accept that going in, then we shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah.
I that's helpful.
Thank you. A question that came up before, and I don't know if James asked it, with apologies for a little bit of a technical timeout, but Mairead, does your development bank have a debarment function? Is it part of like the World Bank's regime?
Yeah, so we do have a debarment procedures, and in fact we align with the OECD on those. Of course, our compliance system is always evaluating the transactions that we get involved with vis-a-vis debarment lists, of which there are many. But we do have a debarment list internally that we use, and certainly and monitor that and update that all of the time. Yeah. And I think that maybe goes back to something Kerry was just talking about, Richard. And, you know, I think there's two different types of things that I see that I talk to companies about. I would say there's like hard debarment lists, and there's soft knowledge of countries and companies. And I'm sure, Kerry, you see that as well, you know, where there's just these lists of companies, which absolutely I think everyone can use to and is point to as really great evidence as to whether to engage or not. but it's also the learnings of working in countries and understanding like the culture and the behaviors and perhaps what's being talked about on the ground versus, you know, that's written down in any list anywhere. And I'm sure, Kerry, that's what you see. Like my companies tell me the importance of having people on the ground, the importance of us being on the ground and actually hearing and seeing what's going on. It's a really tough world out there today with today's media. Is the media being used as a political tool, or is the media actually a good indicator of what's going on in the ground? It's where the Canadian government can help with the Trade Commissioner services. And I know you referred to ombudspersons there as well, Kerry, but like actually talking to the government on the ground, what is happening in these countries. So I'm always encouraging companies to actually ensure that they know what they're getting themselves into. Like you say, Kerry, like can they go and talk to other companies that are working in this country, working with this obligor? And let me tell you, your reputation is a tough one to build, but it's a very easy one to lose. So if there's actually discussions going on in the background around, well, actually I had payment problems with that company, I think everybody will take a soft approach. I think the discussions I've heard over the last week talk more to the hard things like debarment lists and enforcement procedures, but there is actually a way business can use to ensure that they are up to speed on what's going on in different countries and with different companies. I say that's the use of soft power.
So let's talk about soft power. I think that's a great word for it, Mairead. Thank you. So for Kerry and for Ulrich, would you recommend, and for Kerry, it's, you know, for your teams, so for an area in the world where you're not investing, where you're not engaging because of corruption at different levels of government procurement or even semi-owned state-owned enterprises, I mean, do you recommend going to sort of governmental leaders in parts of that same government to say, we are not going to be here, we're not going to provide local resources, investment, education, and you're missing out on local development because of what's happening in this particular ministry? Or do you find that the whole ecosystem is corrupt and it's just better to sort of pack your stuff up and go home? I'd be interested to hear, Kerry, what you've seen in the real world for that. And Ulrich, is that something that you would recommend that companies do from an engagement perspective? So Ulrich, why don't we start with you, and then let's hear what Kerry has to say about that.
I'll answer, and I'll also ask a question to Kerry on that, because it's also linked to the fact that it is from what I normally say to companies, that are you prepared to invest in, not just invest in the business that you're going to do, are you prepared to invest in the risks that you foresee in this country? If they are that, if they say that yes, that it's part of our budget, we need to put more money on compliance and checking and actually preventing corruption happening in that country. And I'd like to ask Kerry later on, maybe you can answer that, whether you actually do a specific budget on those kind of things when you enter into new markets, and that you sort of make that risk assessment very clear. Because when you do that early, obviously also the company and the people who are going to be there understand that, okay, the leadership has said something about this, it's part of our budget, and we need to, we actually have funds to work with this. But on the other question, in terms of how to work in a country that you've not been in, it's a complex market. I mean, it would be very bad to say that, no, we're not going there. I think that would be a failure. I think, however, government and, for instance, when you go in with delegations from different companies, like a governmental or Ministry of Foreign Affairs joint delegation, you should be very clear that we're not going to make any business with you unless this is solved, or unless these contracts will be done in this way. Now, one thing is saying that, the other thing is doing it in reality. And I'm not sure that that is always linked together. I'm Mairead, I'm sure that you try to do that in many senses when you're out, but what happens on the ground then sometimes it's out of your control. Now, if you have people also from government, from embassies working with that and being very clear and helping out, you can try and narrow the gaps. But there is obviously a piece of advice that I normally say to smaller companies. Well, if you think this is going to be a challenge for anybody and you do not want to invest in that, you probably should not be there in the market for the smaller ones, because it will just cost you too much and you lose your reputation and maybe it's not worth it. That's hard to say, but it's part of reality, and it's also voting with your feet somehow. Sometimes you need to do that.
And I could share, you know, in our experience, I mean, it hasn't been all success. I mean, we've had many failures, and it's, when I say failure, and you recognize too late after you're already there that you could have learned something that's, had you asked the right question. And I can give you one example. I won't mention the country, and I'll give you another recent example. I will mention the country, but one example of the country I won't mention, it's in the Middle East. We signed an agreement, we got an order in cabinet, and then our project got held up. $800 million contract, held up. And held up and held up and held up. And it was staggering. We didn't understand why other contracts were advancing that didn't have anywhere, I mean, at a higher price for energy. It didn't make sense. And we had a local partner who gave us assurances, oh, don't worry, it's going to be addressed. And then just this past January, after 4 years, I asked a question. I was in the UAE, and this is not a UAE country, but I was in the UAE at an event, and I said, how is it, I asked other people who did business there, how is it that you're able to get your projects forward, but ours are held up? And what are we doing wrong? Because, I mean, we're Canadian, we're Americans, we're not, I mean, a multinational company. It's like, have we upset someone? We have agreements. And someone said, well, you're not using the right company to do your engineering. I'm shocked. And it turns out the company happens to be owned by the Minister of Energy of that country. And we just by default could not do business with that company. We wouldn't even have considered them. Now, the Minister of Energy owns the largest engineering company in the country. His son runs it, but that violates all of our rules, and we just never would have even thought about it. But that's a quid pro quo, and that's the rule. Okay, use that and your project go forward. We're selling that project as we speak right now because we have no interest in developing a country where that's an accepted way of doing business. A country I will mention as an example of the difference between a commitment and action is the DRC. You know, the DRC historically, I mean, currently today, under 20% electrification, people need power. The former administration, not one in particular, that we've met with on repeated occasions over the past decade, have been made these commitments to getting rid of corruption, which has stunted their growth and investment, but not taking the actions. New administration comes in. I meet the president last year at the United Nations, who we're proud to be a partner and supporter of for 7 years now, and really get to see a president with a vision, and not just a vision and a commitment, but just in the last 6 months, firing, jailing people who are actually participating in corrupt activity. So that tells us that the country at the highest level is doing the right things. And 3 weeks ago, we signed a contract. We're building a plant there of almost $1 billion Canadian, which will be several billion of revenue. It's the largest contract for energy. I mean, we're taking the electrification up from, you know, the mid-teens to 20+%. And it's going to be, I mean, construction will start in the next 12 to 18 months. And so there's an example of you wait, you see, you have to do your homework. And I think many of you have shared this. I mean, having a local partner is critical because you can't understand the culture just by reading about it or reading in the news or checking a list. And as was rightfully said, you know, there are lists, but there's soft lists, there's hard lists, there's, you know, there's so many lists. You have to find someone locally that passes your KYC, is not on any of your lists, that can be your guide. It's like if you're touring in Alaska, you're not going to go off into the woods on your own because you're going to get lost. And every year, hundreds of people get lost, and there's some that don't ever come back. That's a fact. So why would you go to a country where you're going to invest money as well as your life. You're going there, you're putting your time, your energy, and that of your staff, which you're responsible for, their safety, without having a guide. So we will not go to a country where we don't have a good local guide, because one mistake could be the end of a business.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could impair a business, like companies we've seen here in Canada. Great companies that fall for one poor mistake, for lack of transparency, lack of process, and lack of accountability.
Yeah, those are great examples, Kerry. And what you've also demonstrated, and this is, I think, come through everyone's perspective, this is just not about the law. I mean, we have seen companies, particularly in this COVID environment, that have had their reputations significantly harmed. I mean, borderline catastrophic for lawful but awful decisions. And I think that's where it goes back to, and that's where I was struggling with this, with the week of dialogue, was even if you're in a country that has, great institutions, but they're not using them as much as they should. Monday's session talked about the lack of cases. There's not the sort of robust enforcement in Canada that you've seen in other countries. But does that, or should that really make a difference to doing the right thing for a corporation? And I think Kerry's example and Mairead and what Ulrich has talked about is that even if the government isn't the primary driver, right, that doesn't get in the way of companies doing the right thing. So, in Sweden, Ulrich talked about, it took a few scandals to, get people to think about course correcting. So I'd like to hear, because I want to give James some time to wrap us all up here, but any parting thoughts about, we've hit this metaphor pretty hard on the car that Drago started on Monday. Who's the driver here right now as we look at Canada and its anti-corruption journey today? Mairead?
I think it starts with the companies themselves, but we have to give them the tools to try and help them do that. I would say, I think what's changed, Richard, maybe in the last number of years, is the public and the role the public plays. So we talked about that during this week of dialogue. I think we have a very uninformed public, and we have a public that's also focused at the wrong end of this problem. They're focused at the enforcement, the scandal end of this. It's how do we get this to be an understanding of the damage that this can do overall? I think social media is a great tool for that, and we will see more action from the public, who will keep companies more honest and actually get them to focus that. So I think if we can get the front end working, whereby it's seen as the consumer will drive behavior, the companies must react to that, and there are institutions who are going to help them with that and give them the tools and make very clear either the legislative or regulatory environment that they work with. I think that will really drive change. But you cannot, I don't think, sitting on the side. We have to have a culture that is much more principle valued based, and that will drive change, versus one that is just rules based, which then everyone is just looking to see what's the loophole in the rule. So for me, it's cultural change, and it will start with the people actually enacting the transactions, like Kerry. So with the companies and with, I would say, the public actually weighing in and stating what they will accept and not.
Great point. And I don't want James to have to abuse his position of power, because I promised him the 5 minutes at the end. So Ulrich and Kerry, any bite-sized nuggets for us before?
Yeah, just quickly then. I'll just do it. I think one thing that we started in the beginning was that it's good for business. It's also vital for the companies, maybe not survival, but how attractive the company is for future staff and future experts and competence. I think we see that. I mean, you can see that we are not that generation maybe, but the newer generations, they actually look at that and they make a stand, and they said, no, I'm not working for them, I'll work for somebody else for less money, but that's long. So that's a big change, and that's good. That's good for the companies because they understand they have to change from both sides. The other thing is, I think the public sector also needs to take a responsibility in this sector, in the countries that they are working with, both from the embassy part of work, but in particular from the development, international development cooperation side, where you can put in a lot more, I would not say conditionality, that's not what I'm saying, but programs that are targeting exactly those kind of challenges that are in those in particular countries, and focus much more on anti-corruption, rule of law, having institutions and capacity building of institutions that can actually stem corruption. So that's two ways of doing it.
James and I have a mutual friend, Allison Taylor, and she writes about don't underestimate the power of employee engagement. So that's a great point, Ulrich. So Kerry, we have a minute left, a bite-sized nugget for us to think about.
I like the examples, real life examples, because that serves as proof positive of things that work or don't work. But I mean, and again, we're open, we're transparent, and that's what I love about these conversations, because, you know, the point that was just made about social media is so powerful and profound. And we have a contract in the Central Asian country, Uzbekistan, $5-6 billion contract, and signed contract presidents to create, and people who may want to stand in the way, expecting that the old regime, which is, you know, only 2-3 years ago, where the rule of law there, or rule of business there, was someone pays 10%. It's a 10% growth. You win a contract for $1 billion, someone gets enriched by 10%. New president comes in, puts in place all these reforms, anti-corruption, jails people. We have a new contract under this new president, and it's held up. What did we do? We accepted an invitation, Voice of America. It was an hour-and-a-half interview, available on YouTube, over 100,000 views just in their own country. Okay, and 98% of people thumbs up supporting it. The social media, don't underestimate the social media. Don't let someone wrong you and get away with it and not being held accountable. Yeah. And if you don't stand up for yourself, you can't expect others to. And that's our belief, and we will pursue and continue to pursue every day. Uzbekistan, we're pushing and pushing, but that's an example. Because what that social media does is it allows others who are contemplating going into the country to second guess the question. So you're creating pressure on the country to do the right thing. So quite frankly, the only things that work is set examples, put pressure on the countries who are not properly adhering to standards, and whether it's from the Canadian government, who has been fantastically helpful in our continued efforts, as well as the US government has pushed. I mean, Secretary Pompeo was in Uzbekistan. The ambassadors are pushing, saying you have to honor your agreements, and there's not going to be any payments. That social media, and that gets the word out, creates responsibility, accountability at the country, and the fear of reporting. That I think is so critical. And you know what? Maybe the Canadian government that's so outspoken on human rights becomes the caretaker, maybe Sweden or another country, of this list. And people should be afraid, because they should be held accountable when they do something that impairs the human rights of others by putting money in their pocket that robs good people of other opportunities, like an education or healthcare or electricity.
Well, thank you, Kerry. And speaking of social media, as someone who tweets a lot to someone else who tweets a lot, I'm going to turn this over and back to James Cohn. And I want to thank all my panelists, all the panelists today. This has been a wonderful and a robust discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard, for excellent moderation and being able to hop right back in after a technical issue. Ulrich, thank you very much for joining us late in the evening in Sweden. Mairead, thank you very much for joining us from your busy schedule. And Kerry, thank you very much as well for joining us from your exceptionally busy schedule. This has been a really great panel. From my years of working in anti-corruption, we always have questions from companies about, well, what do I do? Just tell me the technical things to do. I think we had a lot of concrete examples today of what Canadian companies and Canadian institutions can do. Some great examples from a former peer before Canada fell out of the top 10 CPI. Maybe we'll climb our way back in, but it was great to hear what's going on in Sweden, that there are still troubles at the top of the CPI, and great examples for even TI Canada for us on how to engage supporters, which is an excellent segue for me to remind everybody about who our supporters are. So a thank you to Export Development Canada as our platinum supporter, our gold supporters, Banque Nationale, Blake's, BLG, Deloitte, Denton's, Siemens, and Skypower Global, of course. And our silver supporters, ACFO, Alicia, Kinross Gold, KPMG, Vidoc Group, and Thales. And if you'd like to be a TI Canada supporter, we don't just want the check, we do very much want financial support, but we do have an engagement relationship with all of our supporters where we have an open dialogue about how we can all move transparency and accountability forward. Do look up on our website, transparencycanada.ca, about how to become a supporter. If you're just in the audience and want to be a TI Canada member, you can sign up. Or if you've loved what you heard and just want to make a direct donation and get your tax receipt now, you can make a donation at TI Canada's website. We encourage all contributions. We rely on these kind of contributions to keep our work going. Join us tomorrow for our final day of the week of Dialogue, where we're going to reflect back on what did we learn about what is wrong with Canada, and have we learned that we're taking corruption seriously enough or not. We'll be joined again by moderators throughout the week. I myself will be on the panel, and I think we're going to have a really good conversation of reflection of the week, and I know all of you who've joined us through the week will probably have comments to give in the chat bar as well. So I look forward to seeing everyone again. Thank you again, Ulrich, Mairead, Kerry, and Richard, for taking time out of your business schedules. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.